Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Michael Harding podcast. And this is Sunday. It's the 13th of August. It's 2 days away from the Feast of the Assumption. And I'm heading off this week for Spain, for Galicia, to walk 110 miles or kilometers of the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. And I'll be reading little bits to myself as I go along the way. And I started this morning with it's a book called The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, and it's by a fellow called Vladimir Losskya. And in the bit that I'm going to read, he's talking about the Apophatic way of prayer. There's two big ways of prayer in the old days, the theologians would tell you. One is the Apophatic, and the other is Cataphatic. Oh, Sherlock, do I know anything about anything? No, I don't. But shall I do try? Now, I'll read you this. It's fierce complicated. It's just a little end of a paragraph. So what'll happen here is you won't kind of be with it for the first couple of minutes, and then gradually it'll start to make sense. Because your ear has to tune itself into the very profound and serious thoughts that are in this book. Apophaticism is not necessarily a theology of ecstasy. It is above all an attitude of mind which refuses to form concepts about God. That's basically what the apophatic tradition is about. It's like saying that God is not something that ever can be contained in concepts. So you're constantly negating ideas of God. It's nearly like atheism in a crazy way, except it always has God beyond it. It's always like, this is not the summit. So the difference between this kind of negative way of faith and somebody like Richard Dawkins is that Dawkins says, I'm on the summit. There's no other way. There's nothing beyond this definition of God, and this definition of God is not true. Whereas the mystic is always saying, this definition of God is not true because he's further up the mountain in the mist, in the mystery. So apophaticism is not necessarily a theology of ecstasy. It's above all an attitude of mind which refuses to form concepts about God. Such an attitude utterly excludes all abstract and purely intellectual theology, which would adapt the mysteries of the wisdom of God to human ways of thoughts. It's an existential attitude which involves the whole person. There's no theology apart from experience. It's necessary to change, to become new as a person. To know God, one must draw near him. No one who does not follow the path of union with God can be a theologian. So it's all about this sense of union with God. The way of knowledge of God is necessarily the way of deification, becoming God, being absorbed in God. He who, in following this path, imagines at a given moment that he has known what God is, has a depraved spirit, according to St. Gregory. Apophaticism is, therefore, a criterion, the sure sign of an attitude of mind conformed to truth. In this sense, all true theology is fundamentally apophatic. It will naturally be asked, what's the function of cataphatic or affirmative theology, the theology of the divine names, which we find made manifest in the order of creation. Unlike the negative way, which is an ascent towards union, this is a way which comes down towards us. A ladder of theophanies or manifestations of God in creation. So the cataphatic way of prayer is, in a sense, responding to what you see as the revelation of God. You know, you might pick a name of God out of the Old Testament, let's say Father, or Lord, or Helper in times of trouble, like whatever name you have for God. It's coming through. It's like a theophany. It's like they're anticipating the revelation of God the Word in Jesus Christ. This is revelation. So one way of prayer is kind of responding to that stuff. And then the other way, the Apophatic way, is moving from name to name or from concept to concept, negating each one, saying that whatever this thing, as we use the word Father, in some way it kind of describes God, but it's not God. It's the terminology, the human sciences of knowing can never touch the mystery of God, which can only be experienced. So going back to the cataphatic way, that's the affirmative theology, God descends towards us in the energies in which he is manifested. We mount towards him in the unions in which he remains incomprehensible by nature. So, in other words, there's God. You know, it says in the Eucharist, by the mystery of this water and wine may we come to share in the divinities of Christ who humbled himself to share in our humanities. So it's like there's some journey in history whereby God is constantly revealing himself to us in the beautiful mystery of life, of creation, all the beautiful things in the world, and in the revelation of the Scriptures, and in the revelation of Jesus. And in the revelation of all those moments in your life where you feel you have been touched by God's presence through some energy or some manifestation of God. Might be intimacy with your beloved, might be sexual intimacy, joy, it might be a child being born, it might be a death, it might be a birth. It might be just sitting in an empty oratory when there's no liturgy at all and it's all silent, and you're looking at an icon and you feel there's some presence touching you, coming towards you. And it's like, it's kind of like a revelation. It's like through his energies God is kind of touching you. And that's balanced, if you like, with the kind of mountain we climb towards God in union with he that remains incomprehensible. We're on that mountain. It's a very special kind of idea. We don't know anything on that mountain. We only have experience. And the mountain is, I suppose the mountain is in solitude. The supreme theophany, that's kind of revelation of God's presence, the supreme theophany, the perfect manifestation of God in the world by the incarnation of the Word, retains for us its apophatic character. This is really interesting now. This is a fellow called Dionysius. He's talking like way back early in the early Christian church, and he's saying that even in the incarnation of the Word, you know, which is like a revelation of God. So in that sense, he'd say, well, that's God reaching out to us. And yet it's not only that. It's God reaching out to us in the person of Jesus, but it's also like in his embodiment, he embodies the hidden unknowability of God. It's doing two things. The super essential was manifested in human substance without ceasing to be hidden after this manifestation, or to express myself after a more heavenly fashion, in this manifestation itself, in this manifestation of let's say, God in Jesus. What is manifested is the hidden unknowability of God. The affirmations of which the sacred humanity of Jesus Christ are the object have all the force of the most preeminent negations. I'll read that again. The affirmations of which the sacred humanity of Jesus Christ are the object have all the force of the most preeminent negation. So that which is affirmed, if you like, when you come into contact with Jesus is the revelation of God, but actually the revelation of God is the unknowability of God. So much the more the partial theophanies of inferior degree conceal God in that which he is, whilst manifesting him in that which he is not by nature. The ladder of Cataphatic theology, which discloses the divine names drawn above all from Holy Scripture, is a series of steps up which the soul can mount to contemplation. These are not the rational notions which we formulate, the concepts with which our intellect constructs a positive science of the divine nature. They are rather images or ideas intended to guide us and to fit our faculties for the contemplation of that which transcends all understanding. So the very notions we have of God, the very ideas we have of God, are really only kind of faculties of the mind which bring us closer to the threshold where we can contemplate God, and contemplation of God is beyond human language or thought. On the lower steps especially, these images are fashioned from the material objects least calculated to lead spirits inexperienced in contemplation into error. It is indeed more difficult to identify God with stone or with fire than with intelligence, unity, being, or goodness. What seemed evident at the beginning of the ascent, that God is not stone, you're at the bottom of the mountain, you're at the basic level of faith, and you're looking at a stone icon of God, and you're saying, well, God is not stone, that's not God. It's just an icon, an image. It's more difficult to identify God with stone or with fire than with intelligence, unity, being, or goodness. What seemed evident at the beginning of the ascent, God is not stone, he is not fire. It's less and less so as we attain to the heights of contemplation, impelled by that same apophatic spirit which now causes us to say, God is not being. God is not good. So the simple space you inhabit at the bottom of the mountain, if you like, you're saying very simple things. God is not in stone, the stone carving of the God. You say, well, that's not God. Or fire being used ritually as God's presence. And you say, well, God is not the fire. He transcends fire. Now, you go up and up the mountain is a sort of a metaphor for the idea of getting more and more complex in your life, in your intellectual understanding of reality. And therefore you get more sophisticated notions of God. Notions like, God is being, ground of being. I do often say, always say, I talk about God as the ground of being, But God is not being either. God is not good. Not synonymous with goodness. And it's more difficult the higher up the mountain you go. I'm using that metaphorically, meaning the more sophisticated your intelligence becomes, it becomes more and more difficult to negate the ideas God is being. You say, well, God is not being. And again, you'll see the crossroads here between yourself and the atheist. I use Richard Dawkins as a shorthand because he's a most intelligent, eloquent, and amazing spirit. But at some point, when you get to the stage of the mountain where you realize you're thinking God is being as a concept, ground, he's the ground of all being. And Dawkins will go off one way and he'll say, no, he's not, and that's the end of it. Whereas you will go on further up the mountain because you'll be saying, well, there's another summit further on. There's another level to God's presence beyond thinking of him as being or as ground of being. There's even beyond ground of being as a concept. The godness is further up this mountain and further into the cloud. At each step of this ascent, as one comes upon loftier images or ideas, it is necessary to guard against making of them a concept, an idol of God. Then one can contemplate the divine beauty itself, God, insofar as he manifests himself in creation. Speculation gradually gives place to contemplation, knowledge to experience. And so you end at some moment where you no longer have a concept of God. You have moved beyond making an idol of God. And you are in the zone of contemplation. And you're contemplating divine beauty. Manifest around you like the leaves of the wild rose, like the beautiful red rose hips bulging with juice, like the blackbird on the cherry tree. And I'm only mentioning just tiny things outside the window. One can contemplate the divine beauty itself, God insofar as he manifests himself in creation. Speculation gradually gives place to contemplation, knowledge to experience. For in casting off the concepts which shackle the spirit, the apophatic disposition reveals boundless horizons of contemplation at each step of positive theology. So the way the apophatic journey into God is working is that each step then of more sophisticated thoughts, concepts of God, each one becomes another possibility to break through that door. And each time you break through the door, you're breaking through a sophisticated concept of God for the possibility of going beyond it, letting it go so that you just experience. In the beauty that's being revealed by God in the world around you, you experience God. And so the process of this journey in faith, if you like, this kind of climbing of the mountain with Moses into the fog, this journey is like a journey all the time towards atheism. It's very liberating because you realize that there is an atheist in all of us, but it's not the atheist that closes the door at some stage and says, and I want no more journey, I want no more investigation, I want no more discussion, it's over. I'll return to my science, I'll return to my knowledge, and I will eat of that tree and no other tree, and that's an end of it. You see the balance between knowledge and the brain and in the mind, and how the mind can slip down into the heart and become love, compassion, which is another name for contemplating the cosmos around you, whether you're contemplating the roses or the little cat with the sore leg that sleeps under the rose bushes, or whether you're contemplating the beloved or your child or your parent. Another name for it is always love. When you contemplate the beauty of divinity that is present in front of you. But you never latch on to it, because you know that this is caused by the energies of God. It's like these energies separate from God come out from God, and then we're just looking at this stuff. But there's something beyond, which is so beyond, it's beyond. And that's where God is. And that the journey towards that destiny is a journey through many, many different complicated, sophisticated, brilliant, intelligent ideas of God, concepts of God, philosophies of God. And yet ultimately you go beyond them all to contemplate. And at each stage, at each new idea about God, you touch it for a second and then you realize it's only a door that you open, that it shatters or kind of dissolves or fragments, and you go through it. And you go higher up the mountain. And you go deeper into the fog of not knowing. And yet each moment you're experiencing. Now this structure, if you like, if you think about this is a wonderful scaffolding of meditational concentration. You know, you bring this around with you in life. So it's really interesting. We think about, you know, meditation and stuff coming from the East and from Buddhism, which I'm fierce fond of and have practiced for years, but in a little way. But I was amazed, you know, when I found it all in the Christian tradition. About 7 years ago, I really started reading the early monastic people and I realized they have these complicated structures for exploring your meditation and for getting you to a place of really calm abiding. And this stuff that I'm reading by Losskya, he was a 20th century theologian, and he's really quoting from St. Gregory Nazianzen. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. He's one of the early elders of the church, if you like. And this wisdom is extraordinary. And it divides again, just to sum it up, into Cataphatic and Apophatic. And Cataphatic is like experiencing the mysteries of God as a revelation to you, you know, through love, through tenderness, through the beauty of the world, divine beauty, manifest in creation, and then in revelation, in the scriptures, in the Psalms, and then finally in the person of Jesus as the sacrament of Jesus, the ultimate kind of revelation, the final, complete, cosmic revelation. Where God is completely revealed in the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. And where in this sacrament, what is revealed is actually the hidden God. You never become familiar with the Lord. He's always revealing how mysterious he is, if you can accept that paradox. And so you go up the mountain, and you go up with Dawkins, if you like, with the atheist. You get away from the more more basic ideas, like at the foot of the mountain, if you like, you're talking about God as, let's say, a stone image or a golden image, And you say, well, that's not God. God is not in the statues. God is not in the temple, to some extent. So you go higher up the mountain, you become more sophisticated, you get deeper ideas about God. You get an idea of God as like, the ground of all being, we'll say. And instead of negating each one and walking away and saying, I've no more interest in conversing with this idea about God, but also avoiding the real danger of actually gripping that concept or that axiom as the truth. Right? God is all powerful, or God is almighty, or God is all goodness. And grasping, when you grasp that truth, you're committing idolatry. That's what they're saying here in these great texts. Because God is always beyond the concept. Always infinitely beyond, and yet is beyond. And that's what draws you up. I'm using the metaphor like Moses going up the mountain, going into the fog, being lost on the mountain alone in order to experience God. And wherever places you go to do that in life, because that's a metaphor for your life journey, ought to be the mountain. And entering deeper and deeper into the obscurity of being, where you have let go of every image of God in order to encounter God in His divine beauty, in His fingerprints all over the universe, in the wisdom of scriptures, and the compassion when you engage in the present moment with other people. And there you go. I'll read another little bit. I'll read another little bit now for you and see where we are. All that we have said about apophaticism may be summed up in a few words. Negative theology is not merely a theory of ecstasy. It's an expression of that fundamental attitude which transforms the whole of theology into a contemplation of the mysteries of revelation. It's not a branch of theology, it's not a chapter, or an inevitable introduction on the incomprehensibility of God, from which one passes unruffled to a doctrinal exposition in the usual terminology of human reason and philosophy in general. Apophaticism teaches us to see above all a negative meaning in the dogmas of the Church. Did you hear that? There's a radical statement from about the 3rd or 4th century. Apophaticism teaches us to see above all a negative meaning in the dogmas of the Church. It forbids us. Forgive me for that break. I just skipped a page. Apophaticism teaches us to see above all a negative meaning in the dogmas of the Church. It forbids us to follow natural ways of thought and to form concepts which would usurp the place of spiritual realities. I love that sentence, The idea that forming concepts can usurp the place of spiritual realities. I use the Asian phrase for that, when you name the bird, you cease to experience the song. And here it is, at the start of Christianity, saying that this experience of encounter with God is always a negative way through the dogmas of the Church, saying that each one is not sufficient in itself, because what God is transcends that. It transcends concepts, transcends meaning, and is not found on the tree of knowledge, but on the fruit of wisdom and the experience of wisdom. For Christianity is not a philosophical school for speculating about abstract concepts. It's essentially a communion with the living God. It's about being here now. It's about engaging with the beautiful rosehip, the leaves turning yellow, the blackbird on the tree. That's why, despite all their philosophical learning and natural bent towards speculation, the fathers of the Eastern tradition, in remaining faithful to the Apophatic principle of theology, never allowed their thought to cross the threshold of the mystery, or to substitute idols of God, concepts of God, for God himself. That's also why there's no philosophy more or less Christian. Plato is not more Christian than Aristotle. The question of relations between theology and philosophy has never arisen in the East. The apophatic attitude gave to the fathers of the Church that freedom and liberality with which they employed philosophical terms without running the risk of being misunderstood or of falling into a theology of concepts. Whenever theology is transformed into religious philosophy, it's always the result of forsaking the apophaticism which is truly characteristic of the whole tradition of the Eastern Church. And I might just finish there, and I'll take it up again sometime. These reflections are very much a sharing that I'm doing with you as I go along learning. So I'm reading this book, and I'm if you like, reading it with you. What an extraordinary book it is, what extraordinary wisdom there is in the whole Christian tradition. And I hope it regenerates in you, as it does in me, the sense of the names of God. You know, the various concepts and descriptions we have of God, we tend to throw them away based on science, rationality, and the persuasive voice of people like Richard Dawkins. But in fact, when you look at things in context of apophatic and cataphatic, the first being the unknowability of God, and then using the latter, the cataphatic, to go through more and more sophisticated ideas of God, but always letting them go as insufficient, always letting them go, knowing that concepts and intellectual ideas and knowledge do not contain God, cannot contain God, can be a door, yes, to deeper senses of awe about the mystery of being here now. I'm doing this podcast really as a special celebratory moment. I'm off for the Camino, and it's the 15th of August. And thank you for being here. Bye-bye.